Hi, I'm Miriam Cates. You're watching GB News Originals. Now, collapsing birth rates are taking the world by storm. A huge threat to our economy and our society, or something we don't really need to worry about? Well, joining me today is the demographer and data scientist Stephen J. Shaw, who has studied this issue more than anyone else that I know. He's been all around the world looking at different countries, different trends, and he even moved to Japan to study the crisis there.
So, Stephen, it's absolutely delightful to have you here. We've seen each other quite a few times now, haven't we, over the years, looking at birth rates and fertility and things like that. But you've got a fascinating new paper out in Nature, the Science Journal, where you look at what's causing, or at least what's driving, the fall in fertility across the Western world. What have you found?
Well, the remarkable thing is that you find the exact same underlying issue in every country I've researched. And right now, I think it's 39 nations, spanning births of over 300 million mothers, going back in some cases to the 60s. And you find this really common pattern.
Yeah.
So the first thing, and it won't surprise everybody, of course, there is no such thing as an average woman. I don't know if you knew that or not, but it's in the data. There might have been an average woman back in the 60s when women tended to marry around the same time, have around the same number of children starting at the same age. But that hasn't been the case for many, many decades. And of course, there's no average woman. Yet researchers do tend to talk about this thing, the average number of children per woman, which is really, we're talking about average person, average parent. And of course, we don't talk enough about men in this. I want to say up front, we should talk about men more. And the reason we don't is we just don't have the birth records. We've got so much information on women, but it's men too, it's parents. So the finding across all these 39 nations is quite simple, that mothers typically want to have and are having 2 or maybe 3 children, or maybe a little more. And that's been the case going back in the UK, going back to 1970. So once you have that first child, more likely than not, you're going to go on and have a second and possibly a third and maybe more. And that trend has not changed. Mothers are having the same number of children as decades ago. And actually in the US, it's the one country where you actually see an increase, not a decrease, an increase in the average family size. So in the mid-1980s, American mothers were having 2.4 children. It's now up to 2.6.
Wow. But that's the opposite of what people think. People think that family size is decreasing. And we know that the total fertility rate, which is this average number of children that women have, is 1.4. And most women want 2.4 children. So the automatic assumption is, well, everybody's having about 1 fewer child than they want. But that's not true. Mothers are having around the number of children that they want to have. But we've got this bigger and bigger group of women who aren't having any children at all.
And that's the exact reason why I wrote this research paper, because, what we've been tending to do in demography is look at data from mothers who are now in their 50s. And this, that means women have had a full opportunity to have a family or not, and we can look at family size. But actually, when you look at trends for women born in the 1960s or 70s compared to 2-3 decades before, of course, they have had fewer children than women who are in their 70s or 80s now. That did happen. But what my research shows that really is since around the 70s, this family size has really, it's come down, and now it's really just hit a plateau. And it's not, to me, it makes sense, frankly, because we know that less than 10% of people want to have only 1 child. The vast majority of people want 2 or more. And if you have 2 or more children, the overall average for a country is probably going to be more than 2. And really, it is. So what are we left with? Well, my research therefore says, well, if mothers are having the same family size as back in the 70s or 80s, the only other possibility is more people are having no children. And what I show is that this trend in childlessness has exploded across the world, but it's exploded in quite interesting ways. It hasn't been like a slow increase in childlessness. There's been these sudden shocks. So if you go back to the most recent shock, which many countries experienced, it was right after the mortgage crisis of 08-09. So you look at the US, Canada, Malaysia, Netherlands, Ireland, all of those nations since that time have had a huge increase of childlessness. And for the UK, Italy, Japan, actually goes back to the oil shock of 1973, which I just about remember. But you can really see, what we're saying here is that these people are people who were probably going to have children, but delayed it. So when you delay parenthood, what happens is some, not all, but some people miss out on the experience for many reasons.
So people who were intending to have children because of the dramatic change in economic circumstances thought it's a bit too risky to start a family now, potentially, left it a couple of years and then found for whatever reason that they didn't have the right partner or they couldn't conceive because they'd become too old. Is that what you're suggesting is a likely explanation?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to refine one thing, because we can see in the data that biological infertility doesn't really start to kick in until women are mid-30s. Okay. Of course, some women earlier, yes, absolutely. But the big thing is what I call this unplanned childlessness. People not having a partner, going through a breakup, assuming they meet Mr. or Miss Perfect at age 32, and often it doesn't happen. Finance can have a role, but really only in, again, causing people to think, well, not this year, maybe next year. And of course, you have to have a partner who's thinking the same way as you at the same time.
Yeah.
So the fascinating thing to me for my current research is to show that without knowing the country name, without knowing the year of data, you can pretty much pinpoint what this childlessness rate would be based on the average age that a society is starting to have children. And as it gets later, childlessness goes up in a highly predictable way.
Gosh.
So I think we've been over-optimistic and rather uneducated. I think I can say that because I think in all education systems that I've looked at around the world, no one's really telling young people about this fertility window.
And we did some polling a couple of years ago, didn't we? That showed that 2/3 of young women thought that it was fine to wait till 35 to start planning your family. And a similar number of young women thought that because of modern science, you could essentially have a baby at any age. So do you think people have got in the back of their minds, well, I'd like to find a partner and have children by my early mid-30s, but if I don't, there are these other options available. And yet those other options are not a guarantee by any means.
Yeah, and I think you've shared with me before ads on the tube that I've seen myself, and telling young people, young women to enjoy their life and to postpone because we've got egg freezing, we've got IVF, etc. I think quite a crass way, to be honest with you, because the reality is a lot of young people want to be parents and enjoy being parents at a younger age. But yeah, absolutely, we have been fooling ourselves because the data does not show any major uptick in terms of outcomes from IVF or other treatments. Now, of course, there's success stories. Of course, there are success stories. But the reality is, looking at the data, for every success story, behind that story, there's multiple people who tried and failed, but also never got to the point of trying. Yes. The eggs are frozen, but where's the partner?
Yeah.
Or I'm too tired now, or all sorts of other factors.
So in individual cases, IVF can be a great help, but it's no answer at all to this whole of population problem we've got, which is too many people not having the children that they want to have.
Yeah, and it's wonderful. IVF works for some people. Of course it is. But the reality is, the more you focus on those technologies, the lower the overall birth rate, because it encourages people to think, I can wait. And the statistic to share with you about the UK right now is that a woman turning 28 without a child has a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother. Gosh. 28.
Wow.
Now, that's not biology. That's just because by age 28, a lot of people who were going to settle down have already done so.
Yeah.
The available partners who might think like you are probably getting fewer and fewer. And of course, as we get older, we tend to kind of be more firm in our mindsets in terms of what we're looking for. We have to find someone who likes the same holidays as us, who we have to like their friends. They have to like our friends. Yeah. And, we get choosier.
Whereas if you partner up in your early 20s, you don't really know yet what your adult self is like. And so you learn, I suppose, with someone else. So what seems really key to this is this average age of having children, which means an average age of partnering up is probably 2, 3, 4, 5 years earlier than that. So what kind of things affect that? Why do some countries are women still having children younger than in the UK, for example, and in some countries I assume having children older than the UK? What's driving those differences?
Yeah, I think really all industrialized nations are experiencing a significant delay to what it would have been a few decades ago. So there is a phase that goes beyond what we're going through right now. And it really is potentially a terminal phase. I mean, I just have to say it the way it is. When you look at countries like South Korea, where the average age of motherhood is getting up to around 32, you see a huge rocketing of the number of one-child families that we don't see anywhere else. It's around 40% now. Japan's 20%, which is more typical. But you get to this point where a country, not only are people having fewer children, fewer people becoming parents, because it's delayed, the likelihood of having only one, goes up.
And is that because if the average age is 32, that means plenty of people aren't having their first child. Right. So let's say 35, 36. And then sadly, your chance of having a second child are quite reduced at that point.
No, you're absolutely right. The thing about averages to remember is it is an average. There's people younger, there's people older, of course, and just more people are hitting up against that biological barrier. And yet we all, hear stories, know friends who had children much later.
Yes.
Much later. But more and more, those are the exceptions. And what I don't think we've got a good sense of is the grief and the loneliness that can happen to people who had dreamed of having a family and how deep that can be. So, people who don't have children and wanted a family, very sadly, they're not being interviewed in the media. They're not protesting in the streets. It's a very quiet kind of grief, and that's the term they use for this.
And in your documentary, Birth Gap, which you produced, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, you interview men and women around the world who always intended to become a mother or a father, but didn't. And it is incredibly moving, their stories. But none of them planned it that way. They all just assumed it would happen.
Yes. And you'll hear stories. You'll see men and women break down in the documentary. So it's not only about women. And if anything, the men I talk to about this, often men don't want to open up, but those that did, I would say, have an even deeper grief than the women in some cases. And it can be IVF didn't work, didn't meet the right partner. Or in one case, someone, this man who's now in his 60s, married someone who already had kids. And they planned to have one more together.
But didn't.
But couldn't.
Yes.
And it has been torture for him to see his wife's children grow up.
Yeah.
To the point that he would have to go to an attic study room anytime there's family celebrations, because he just cannot bear what he missed out on.
Gosh. But it's not just, the personal sadness aspect is hugely important, and that's reason enough to help people to have children and overcome those barriers. But it's not just a personal issue. This is a huge economic issue for our economies. And if we just look at, for example, the number of, the ratio between working age people and retired people, how that's changed since the 70s. I think in the 70s we had about 4.5 working age people to retired people. We're now down to each one. We're now down to 3 to 1. We're approaching 2 to 1. This is an economic catastrophe in the making. Why aren't governments paying more attention to this?
I think they could have had an excuse a few years ago that, they didn't really know that birth rates, because few people were talking about it, as you know from your time in Parliament. You were one of the first, actually, perhaps the first to actually raise this as an issue. But they can't make that excuse now. This is in the newspapers, in the media constantly, I feel. Yeah. And I think it's clear to me that some politicians, some parties have been happier to start talking about this. Others have been more cautious. But that has to change because this affects everybody, left, right, and central. So I see it around the world that more and more politicians are starting to embrace this. And in my experience of dealing with some senior politicians, more than one has just put their head in their hands when they're talking about this and just shaking because they don't know what to do.
Yeah. Well, and some of the things that countries are trying, so Hungary is a particular example, South Korea obviously, are trying to encourage women who already have children to have 1 or 2 more. But yet, from your research, surely it would make more sense to find out the barriers that are stopping women having the first, because we know that once you have the first, you probably will go on to have 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, that's right. There are some schemes that have had glimmers of hope. Hungary, actually, I feel has done best, although it hasn't solved their birth rate problem. They have a number of schemes to help younger people to acquire homes.
Yeah.
They write off student debts for women who have a child under 30, certain circumstances. And we have seen this bubble of younger people in Hungary start families that really has not happened elsewhere. But one of the ironies is what you almost need to do as a society, just looking at the data and numbers, so this is not my opinion, but just looking at the data, you almost have to take away incentives from those over 30 having children and put it all to focus on those.
So that there
under 30.
is a window that you know you've got to hit.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. And I don't think that's going to be easy for any society to do, but it may be essential.
So what we're talking about really is normalising young parenthood again. And do you think there is something in, of course there are economic barriers to having children, there's all sorts of very good reasons why people don't or can't have children in their early or mid-20s. But I just wonder if so much of it is what you see as normal. And I had my first child at 25. I didn't think anything of it. But actually, everybody in my family has had children young for generations. And so I saw that as normal. But if that's not your norm, it's actually really odd now for women to start thinking in their early 20s about having children. That would mark you out as very unusual.
Yes. And one of the interesting things, again, from the data, from my current research, you get this curve, I call it the vitality curve, of when the peak age for any society is. And it's a perfectly symmetrical curve by age. So you take a country like the UK, where the average age of starting a family for a woman is around 30, give or take.
Yeah.
The number of new mothers aged 25 is the same as the age 35. 20 is the same as 40. So the whole society shifts together.
So people are just really sensitive to this sense of what's normal, whatever normal is.
Yes, and it's not even a personal sensitivity, because you need to find a partner who's on the same page, and your partner's also sensitive. Now, if you have a child with that partner is now not available to anybody else. So we're all interconnected in the decisions we make. So we therefore shift together.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's not an issue for us personally about the age we choose. It's everybody else.
Yes. It's a collective action
It's
problem.
a collective action problem.
And one of the things that's made it, that I think has shifted people's parenthood ambitions later, is university. And back in the 70s, I think around 10% of the population went to university. Most people left school at 16, maybe 18. Now you've got 50% of young people going to university, plenty of others doing other training courses. You don't really start your adult life till 21, 22. Then you've got debt. We've basically shifted all of adulthood up a few years, haven't we?
And that's the problem. It's really, we have created a situation where it's impractical for young people mostly to think of having a child younger. And therefore, that's where the solution is. So again, this is not a UK issue. Education across, in fact, I want to say the entire developed and developing world has focused on education, taking women and men later into their 20s before it's feasible. I mean, something like, surprised me, it may surprise you, Thailand has one of the worst birth rates, around 1.2 children per woman there. 55% of young people, of women, go to university in Thailand, which surprised me. So this is always linked. So are we going to take education away from women? Absolutely not. I mean, that's... let me just say on record.
Well, absolutely. And it's politically impossible. And most people would think that's probably the worst thing you could do.
Yeah. So actually, to me, therefore, the solution lies elsewhere. It's certainly not that. It's shifting towards lifelong learning.
Yeah.
So I would love to see a year taken out of high school.
Yes.
And a year taken out of university. And maybe it'd be more of like a certification you would get. You would go into employment, early 20s. And then you shift to kind of some evening, weekend classes, summer classes. And that, if that became the norm, I think the advantages in terms of getting people into the workforce earlier, but allowing them to fine-tune their education. Yeah. So many people study something like biology, so if I recall that was your specialization, and decide they want to become accountants or TV presenters.
One of my many careers.
So I think, we can do a lot to help young people get on the career path sooner.
Yes. And that would also help with the debt issue that we've seen in this country particularly, which is that not only have young people potentially lost a few years of their life in university, they've also been saddled with £50,000 of debt. That's the norm now, which they probably then feel they've got to pay back before they get on an even keel and able to start a family. So I think that would be popular policy in many, many ways. But what do you say to the people who think, this isn't really a problem, we're just going to have to learn to live with fewer children, immigration's the answer? I mean, do you think, there is any truth in that, or should we be very, very alarmed by your findings?
Well, if those people have solutions to how to fund future pensions, how to maintain the NHS or any healthcare system, how to look after people, later in life, and at the same time have a solution to say, you know what, we've got a solution to the birth rate crisis a generation or 2 generations from now, then I would listen to them. But no one has.
Yeah.
It's a very easy comment to say this doesn't matter. What you're really saying is society doesn't matter, economics doesn't matter, because everything's linked to this.
Yeah.
And no society in history has been known to come out of the crisis we are now in.
Yeah.
And this is not a new crisis for the UK, by the way. We're looking at the numbers now because we've started to notice this started 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And really has been unrelenting since that time. So there's little to celebrate here.
And I think something else that isn't understood is the link between natural population growth, so having children, and economic growth. And we look back to the 80s and the Thatcher era as a time of great economic growth, but it also happened to be the time when the baby boomers, one of the biggest generations in history, came of age in their 20s and 30s, their most productive age, their most dynamic age. We had a huge boom of people coming into the workforce at that age. That definitely contributed to growth. It's very hard to see how we're going to get population growth when we've got a rapidly declining number of young people coming into the workforce.
It transforms everything from a business perspective. I studied for an MBA more than 30 years ago, and I don't think MBA programs have changed very much because it's all about growth.
Yeah.
Growth markets in terms of, you want to ideally enter a business market that's growing where there's going to be more people. That's how your business grows. And we're going to be entering a cycle where almost investment becomes, a thing of the past, because the idea, I'm going to put my money in this because this market will grow. And almost every market will be shrinking. And in time, they all will shrink. So people talk about degrowth as if it's some cool new thing. No, we need to, focus on degrowth, but no one knows how to do that yet.
Because there's a shrinking pie. But that's also interesting. You're saying almost every market. I think some people still think that this is a Western crisis, but it's not, is it? There are countries that are still poor, that haven't industrialized, and yet are still seeing shrinking birth rate. That's a new thing.
You look at India. So India is now the most populous country on the planet, and some people worry about India having too many people. Births peaked in India in 2001. The only reason the total population, or total head count, as I like to call it, of India is growing is people aren't dying young anymore.
Age is still expanding. Longevity is still expanding. Yes. Okay.
So for time, people will end up living as they mostly are. I think 70s, 80s, and even longer in India and other countries who have gone through that development cycle. But that will stop. Old people are not having children anywhere in the world, from what I've seen. So we already can see India's already on the downward path.
Yeah.
And if you go to, for example, in the South, most of the South has got low birth rates. Some states have had low birth rates since the 1990s on similar levels to Europe. And we just talk about this total head count, and averages are terrible.
Yes, which you've shown. And China as well. Of course, everybody thinks of China as a very, very populated country. They have been, and they famously introduced a one-child policy to try and control population growth. But they're really struggling to reverse that now that their total fertility rate has declined so much.
I think what we've learned from China is that social policies to engineer birth rates are fraught with danger. I assume, I don't know, of course, but I assume China felt that once it lifted its one-child policy, everyone would rush to have 2 or 3 children.
Yes.
But after 30 years of that policy, the entire social system in China appears to have been engineered around raising and educating that one child. So I imagine that means apartments are geared up for, just one child. The education system may be expensive to realistically only be able to afford
and
that.
The experience of family. So your experience of family would have been you're an only child. You've got 2 parents who are completely focused on you, 4 grandparents who are completely focused on you, no cousins, no siblings, no aunts and uncles. That's your experience of family. Why would you experiment with something different when you become an adult?
So what impact will that have on society where people do not have extended families at all, and everyone's like that? I would not like to be China in this current crisis.
So if you were world leader right now, Stephen, I'm sure you'd love to be, what would you do? Because so much of this is about personal choice. And of course, there are cultural and economic factors feeding into that do change people's behaviour. But how would you tackle this such a sensitive but such an important topic?
First thing I would do is tell us to stop looking at this total fertility rate, which measures the average woman. I just say that should be banned, actually.
Okay, yeah.
We need to look at much more granular data in terms of family size, and we'd probably notice that in all nations is generally pretty static. And we focus on the real problem, which is unplanned childlessness, and behind that, the age at which people are becoming parents, and the focus on measuring that. And more specifically, how do we support those young people who might want to, we should never coerce people to have children who don't want children. I should say that. We should not. And we don't need to, because it's quite a small proportion of people. But how do we better enable young people to have the children they want to have, especially when they hear that at age 28, like in the UK, they have less than a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother? I think it comes down to reinventing the 20s. I think it comes down not just to focusing on lifelong education, but in fact to changing how we hire people, the career progression. And I think government has a role to support employers who genuinely, I mean, what about hiring someone and giving them up to a 7-year sabbatical? But they're still an employee.
Yes.
They still go to the Christmas party. They still have that email address. They still do training. They might even work a little bit.
Bit of part-time work,
Yes.
But they've got a guarantee to come back to their career where they left off when they've finished raising their children.
Yes. And if they don't come back, maybe there should be some penalty or some tax thing to say, well, you didn't come back. It gets complicated at that point. But I do think the answer will be around, well, let me put it this way. I think those nations that survive this, and not all nations are going to survive this, those that do will be ones that reinvent the 20s.
That's fascinating. Well, so much food for thought. Stephen J. Shaw, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the GB News Original channel below, and don't forget to download the GB News app.